All right, everyone. Welcome to the next session of the CarbonPositive Reset 1.5 Global Teach-In. This session is Proliferating Renewables, Generating and Procuring Renewable Energy. You'll see the description, course description, and learning objectives. If you're applying for AIA credits, we will email you after the teach-in to give you details about how you submit for those. This is the required slide in order for you to gain those credits. We will be doing question and answer at the end of the session, but we will likely not answer all of your questions. And so we will be collecting those and posting them to the website with written answers post teach-in. So please look out for an email summary of that question and answer reply. I'm Vincent Martinez. I'll be your moderator for the session. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Architecture 2030. Today, I'm joined by two esteemed colleagues, Cole Roberts, America's Energy Business Leader for Arup, to talk about renewable energy on site and generation, and Stephen Abbott, a manager at Rocky Mountain Institute, who's going to talk about renewable energy procurement offsite the building. With that, I will turn it over to Cole to get us started. Thank you, Cole.
Thank you, Vincent. It's wonderful to be here today. So a little bit about Arup, just to provide some context. Arup is a fairly large employee-owned and mission-driven firm with about 15,000 global staff. And we trust and believe in the quality of being a learning organization where individuals assembled together, connecting with one another, assemble knowledge in a rich ecosystem, much like the ecosystem that's present today with all of you. I think we have a couple hundred people on the call right now. The graphic in front of you is a globe of individuals around the outside of the globe, each of which is booking time to a research project within 1 year of activity within Arup. And as you can see, not one individual is necessarily more bright than the others, and it's the interconnected web of their learning that paints the picture of knowledge. And that's hopefully what we'll share a bit of today and start a process. We do a lot of collaborative research. This was last fiscal year for us, internal website that we maintain where we look at all of the projects that we undertake as research and development. There's about $50 million last year across 3,300 projects. Many of the insights that I'll raise today are born of or amplified by those research investments. One of which was a book that we published in 2013 called 2 Degrees, the Built Environment and Our Changing Climate. In that book, we clarified and set as a frame that climate change is really occurring in 2 parts, that there's a need for mitigating the impacts of climate change, as well as recognizing that there's an adaptation that's going to be required, that mitigation can't get us out of where we are on a trajectory to arrive. And that's something that I want to bring to the fore today in Proliferating Renewables, this intersection between mitigation and adaptation, between decarbonization and resilience. And I love it when people are paying attention, and to make that attention more crisp, I wanted to offer this question. What climate event happened 28 years ago, only to repeat 2 years ago? And if you can answer that question, you can put it in the chat box, and hopefully that's one way to connect us all, and I'll send the first person to answer it correctly $28 probably as a check. And there will be hints along the way in the presentation. So I'm going to tell this story a little bit in 3 acts. The first act sets us back a few years to 2015 and the effort made to accelerate decarbonization. At that time, we had recently finished a seminal report for the state of California, looking across 12 commercial and residential prototypes through to the year 2020 and over nearly 500 million square feet per year of development, asking the question whether or not it was technically feasible for zero net energy buildings in California to be achieved. From a simplistic standpoint, we knew that there was a diminishing return in the efficiency curve between what happened in the past, what could happen today, and what could happen in the future. And that layering on-site renewables could deepen that curve, but that on-site also had a diminishing return. But that eventually the grid supply would meet, and that in parallel, those three actors would achieve zero net energy and decarbonization. That simple story was assessed in a much more deep fashion in the actual report. We looked across the climate zones in the state of California, which you'll see on the left, from desert to mountain, across all of the different building typology, from warehouse to single family to restaurants, and by construction volume. The energy use intensity, shown here as time-dependent value, but the energy use intensity obviously varies across those climate zones and typologies of building. When we applied renewable energy in the form of solar arrays to rooftops and parking lots next to those facilities, we found that the vast majority could achieve zero net energy from a desk study basis, but that quite a few, due to their high energy intensity, could not meet those commitments on site. That gave rise in part to an affectionately titled policy report in 2015 called Zero Net Energy Has Left the Building, taking a cue from Elvis Presley. That policy report argued for the case for off-site authorized buildings. Those were buildings that could not achieve zero net energy on site, whether they be shaded, whether they be high density, or whether they be high energy users, and that such off-site authorized buildings needed to have an access to offsetting zero carbon power through aggregated efficiency resources and aggregated renewable generation brought to them through a zero net energy aggregator. We highlighted a compliance path for the code so that any building could achieve this pathway. First, that there would be a modeling of the building loads. Second, that those loads would be translated into a common metric. Third, that the question of whether or not sufficient on-site resources could be asked, and if there were sufficient on-site resources, that those on-site renewable energy resources would be put into place to match the modeled energy target for the building. If those sufficient on-site resources were not present, that building would be off-site authorized. And they would have a partial on-site resource as well as the remainder from a utility or aggregated zero carbon power supplier. This has largely come to be the direction that the Zero Code has taken, which I believe most of you would have heard about earlier in the day. It also, to some extent, oversimplified the situation by suggesting that the grid acts in an annualized fashion, when in fact the grid sees everything from hourly, daily, or even smaller time constant. So this is the duck curve for people that aren't familiar with the duck curve, covering 24 hours in the life of the grid, and the demand from early morning to late afternoon, and the penetration as a result of renewables on the grid bellying out that duck. So if you can imagine the belly at the bottom by 2020, and then the head as people turn on their lights and televisions and park their cars in the late afternoon as the sun sets. And that the main issue was not an annual issue, but is indeed what's called a ramp rate issue, which is the speed of change on the grid from the peak of renewable energy production to the peak of use late in the day. That was Act 1. Now we're in 2020 and in a state of crisis. Crisis from a health standpoint, crisis from an equity standpoint, crisis from a climate standpoint. We're also in a point of opportunity and potential inflection. This information from the International Energy Agency highlights the annual change in global energy related to CO2 emissions projected for this year. And you could see that this year, the expectation is that the downturn in energy use will outpace every other year back to 1900, a major change. At the same time, although most energy sources, coal, gas, oil, nuclear, are going to contract significantly, renewables is projected to continue to increase. And it is an opportunity for us to double down on what works. One aspect of why this may be working is because the rates themselves are prompting people and companies to move towards renewable energy, not for moral or political concerns, but for economic ones. This rate sheet from just one community in California highlights the base PG&E rate compared to the PG&E solar choice rate. And as you can see highlighted, the solar choice 100% renewable rate is actually less costly than the base rate. Why on earth would anybody not be moving to 100% renewable energy sourcing? And of course, in an economy when we're pushing for job creation, the jobs that are created locally in our communities from renewable energy placed on our rooftops or in the grid are a great opportunity for us to recover and build back better. Of course, this isn't just a political issue of one party. You see a diversity of perspectives arguing the basis for renewables incorporated into our building stock, and the great opportunity for us to come together around renewable energy and its proliferation. We will recover, and as we recover in the years to come, Act 3 is about renewables integrated with storage. As I mentioned, that duck curve paints a picture of grid destabilization, not because of the amount of renewables penetrating the grid, but because of when they turn on and turn off and how the grid copes with that variability. So we're seeing the rise of energy storage at the point of generation, which Steve will talk about in a moment, on the grid, transmission and distribution, or in homes and businesses. And it's with this last one that I'll tell a story about integrating solar and battery storage through a program called Solar Resilient, I believe, which was being highlighted today in some of the tools sessions. This was an initiative bringing two priorities of urban sustainability together. Those that are focused on resilience and emergency response, with those that are focused on decarbonization and the environment, joining forces to advance both ends. For years in the Americas, as well as elsewhere in the world, there has been a recognition of instability in the climate and instability in our cities as a result of grid instability. You see the fires here in California. This is actually from last year, not this year, as well as Hurricane Sandy on the right. And those natural disasters may vary, but they're generally across our countries and our country. Something that we are all, or the most urban centers are in some way or fashion threatened by. So I'm going to tell a story a little bit about a series from 2015 to present of the Solar Resilient Initiative. What is Solar Resilient? It's a program that by integrating solar PV and energy storage, we realize that our power system can be better protected from grid power losses caused by those disasters such as floods, wildfires, tornadoes, earthquakes, storms, and hurricanes. And it can provide revenue the rest of the time. When a disaster strikes, where will people go? It depends a bit, but many people will shelter in place. Even those that shelter in place will depend on shelters, most people will shelter in place. Others will depend on shelters for day use. 5 to 15% of city residents may be displaced to those shelters. And will those critical facilities be ready? Will they have light and security, warmth, food and drink, communication services, medical, and people to help? Distributed PV plus battery storage is an answer across emergency operations centers, rec centers, libraries, fire and police stations, schools, and places of worship. To ensure Displaced people are happier, healthier, and safer. And our cities can bounce back faster. Safer can also be cleaner and provide annual revenue throughout the year. We know the grid needs energy storage. We know the grid needs to be cleaner, and that solar plus storage at the portfolio scale can be a grid resource and serve the most vulnerable populations first. This is a census block study showing disadvantaged community census tracts as a prioritization filter for the first installations of solar resilient systems. And filtered by climate hazards, in this case showing wildfire high and very high risk zones overlaid with school sites highlighted in little red and blue dots. And it's the focus to not build out these systems in high and very high hazard zones. A similar type of analysis and filtering can occur for flooding. The brilliance is that this serves all political constituencies eventually, since all of our cities and all of our neighborhoods have these facilities, schools and rec centers in them. In 2015, the Department of Energy funded a $1.3 million study of solar plus storage for critical facilities in San Francisco. Case studies, roadmaps, financing, a website, and an economic study were all completed. 225 critical facilities were mapped. Detailed case studies and a website, solarresilient.org, were published for anyone to use. The team found 42 shelters and 25 libraries identified for a system installation at a cost of approximately $60 million. And that 50,000 people could sleep overnight for 3 to 7 days, and 225,000 people could day use the shelters with 12 megawatts of solar and 12 megawatt hours of battery storage. Notably, the economic benefits were found to exceed the costs by more than a ratio of 2 to 1, and that the cost to the city would be less than $4 per person per year. In 2019, East Bay Community Energy applied those lessons learned from San Francisco and scaled and amplified the impact to 26 new cities, adding automated scripting, service walkability scores, additional hazard scoring, and an RFP process. Think about that from a proliferation standpoint. It went from 1 city in 3 years to 26 cities in 1 year, twice as many facilities, 75% less cost to undertake the work, and 3 times faster speed of delivery. The planning requires substantial stakeholder engagement from many different parties. There's the need to understand the portfolio and prioritize facilities based on their hazard exposure, their proximity to disadvantaged community and low-income zones, and their service to the local population. This is showing walk radii, 20-minute walk radii to each of the facilities. 499 facilities were prioritized, 499 facilities were scored, 423 were prioritized, and batch run using solarresilient.org to achieve an 11 megawatt aggregated solar PV and 24 megawatt hour aggregated battery storage system, which is now in active movement through an RFP process to reduce the system cost and streamline the implementation. What if solar resilient planning is proliferating? Solar resilient planning is already proliferating statewide and has the potential to shelter millions, and it can go nationally as well as globally. So here we are in the final act in the year 2035, and that is a better way toward an affordable, resilient, and clean energy transition with proliferation of renewable energy on the rooftops of both our critical facilities, as well as all of those facilities that we feel need them most. And with that, I'm going to hand over to my friend Steve to talk a little bit about the utility scale.
Thank you, Cole. So again, I'm Steve Abbott from Rocky Mountain Institute, and I'm going to be talking about proliferating offsite renewables. As Cole mentioned, many buildings are unable to power their operations with on-site installations alone, and this can be due to a variety of issues. They might lack solar irradiation, they might lack roof space or land to install sufficient on-site renewables. They might require, or they might have energy-intensive equipment, such as data centers that they need to power. There might be significant nighttime usage. Fortunately, and again, as Cole already mentioned, the costs of renewable energy, particularly from offsite renewables, have come down dramatically over the last 10 years. What I'm showing here is data from Lazard Investment Bank on the levelized cost of energy, which is an all-in number to calculate on a unit basis the cost of energy from different sources. And it's designed to be sort of a very apples to apples comparison, taking into account upfront installation costs, maintenance, and fuel costs for conventional resources. And what you see here, and this does not include any national or local subsidies, is that solar PV and wind at the large scales that they are typically built at for offsite installations are in fact among the cheapest forms of energy that can be built today. And a particular add-on to this is that you'll note there's a gold star in nuclear and the coal rows. That $29 and $33, those represent marginal costs from existing facilities. So in some cases now, it's cheaper to build a new wind or solar facility than it is to continue running existing plants. Potential buyers can start the process of thinking through offsite options by considering how much energy they want to purchase. They might start this by looking at the annual electricity usage of a building, subtracting out any energy efficiency potential that they might be able to access, further reducing out any potential for on-site generation, and then you're left with a net remaining electricity need. And you then have to ask the question of, do you want to meet all of this all in one go? Is there a particular percentage of this that you want to achieve with this first transaction, etc.? Once you've established how much energy you want to buy, it's important to then consider your other priorities. Some buyers are really focused on financial savings, tapping into the low cost of energy that we just talked about. Others might prefer or really be focused on the long-term cost certainty that these renewable contracts can sometimes bring. They might want to focus on transaction simplicity or the environmental impact. And this can be a range from maximizing the greenhouse gas emissions reductions, or can focus more on preserving wildlife and minimizing any impacts to cultural heritage sites. There can be reputational benefits from these transactions. So towns or cities or large companies that want to focus on that may choose to focus on large, particularly newsworthy types of transactions. Or you might want to focus on local benefits with things like local jobs, increasing the local tax base, improving community health and resilience, as Cole was talking about, or other local benefits. Once you've gone through that process, you're now in a position to start thinking about the potential structures. And I'm going to be spending a fair amount of time here going through a variety of transaction structures that may be applicable to building owners and communities within your area. The first is renewable energy certificates, then virtual net metering, then community solar, green tariffs, off-site power purchase agreements and direct purchases, and virtual PPAs, or again, power purchase agreements. Let's start with RECs. So renewable energy certificates, or RECs, offer a simple mechanism to offset conventional energy usage. And it's important to understand here that with an off-site facility, unlike a rooftop PV system, once that electricity is added to the grid, it's impossible to trace electrons or electrical charge through the grid infrastructure. It's similar to a bucket of water into a stream. Once you've done that, there's no way to understand where all those little droplets go or somehow put that bucket back together. So as an alternative, we have created RECs, or renewable energy certificates, which track the legal right to claim that you have owned, and in some cases have used, that renewable energy. You claim that you have used it by retiring the REC. And so RECs are going to be important as we think about all of these different transaction structures. But in this case, some buyers choose to purchase RECs directly from renewable generators or with the help of a REC broker. And these RECs are purchased in one-off transactions every year, and thus they offer a very simple, relatively straightforward way to purchase renewable energy. A potential downside for RECs is that in most cases, there's not a strong argument to say that by buying a REC, you are enabling new generation to be brought online or constructed. And this concept of additionality, as it's usually referred to, drives many purchasers to look at other potential options. So one of these is virtual or remote net metering, which allows buyers to receive the same financial benefits that they would if they had installed the system on their own property behind their own meter. So this is enabled in a number of US states. Effectively, it allows an energy buyer to go and find a local renewable energy project, say one at a local airport. They can agree to pay for the energy that's generated and receive the RECs in return. The local renewable energy project delivers electricity to the local utility because there's no wire connecting that project to the buyer. The local utility continues to serve the energy buyer as they have been. Again, there's no way to trace the electricity once it enters the grid. But then the buyer receives a net metering credit, which is designed to simulate what would have happened if that facility was on their own rooftop or on their own property. A similar transaction structure is community solar, which allows multiple buyers to purchase panels or generated electricity from a single installation. And like the remote net metering, these installations tend to be relatively small and located within a community or a city. And while energy buyers can sometimes contract directly with the owner of the renewable energy project, as I showed in the previous example, here I'm going to walk through a slightly different structure where the local utility is acting as a middleman for the program. So in this case, we have a local utility that's serving energy buyers. Those energy buyers have asked for renewable energy, so the local utility goes out and finds the local renewable energy project. It pays that project for the energy and RECs that are generated, and then passes those RECs along to the energy buyers in many cases. Finally, there is a true-up where the energy buyers are paying for the renewable energy and getting credits, and the exact nature of those credits and the value vary program to program. Green tariffs are utility programs that allow large customers to purchase energy from large-scale off-site renewable energy projects. I'm not showing a diagram here because the setup is essentially the same as what we just looked at. The utility will go and find a large renewable project, buy that energy, and then transfer it to the large customers. So the key distinctions here are really the scale. First, the customers tend to be larger customers with large loads, so think data centers or large companies, or projects are very large and are no longer located within a particular community. What I'm showing here is a map from the World Resources Institute, which shows the states in the US where green tariffs have been executed or where legislation exists. Interestingly, there's a variety of states here that are colored pink, and these are where electric retail choice is easily available. And what that means is that the buyers have a great deal more flexibility to contract with entities other than the utility. I tee this up because this is really the situation where the next type of transaction is going to be most relevant. These are offsite projects. These can be offsite power purchase agreements or direct purchases where an energy buyer is contracting with a large offsite renewable energy project. Now, I mentioned PPAs or power purchase agreements a couple of times. This is a structure where the energy buyer agrees to pay a fixed dollar per megawatt hour over a long period of time, usually 10 to 20 years at a minimum. Alternatively, the energy buyer can agree to buy the entire facility outright within a direct purchase. However, given the size of these installations and the nominal value of them, that's relatively rare. So if we focus on the PPA structure, the energy buyer would agree to pay this fixed dollar per megawatt hour over time. The renewable energy project would generate RECs and return those to the energy buyer. It would generate electricity and deliver that electricity to the energy buyer via the local grid. Now, we've talked about how energy can't really be traced through the grid. So what this is really showing is that there is a financial settlement using the grid's tracking mechanisms to credit that energy buyer with the energy that it is getting from the renewable energy project. Alternatively, virtual or synthetic power purchase agreements allow customers to financially support a project and purchase the renewable energy certificates without actually using the generated electricity. You might be wondering why people would want to do this, and I'll explain that after I go through the structure. So the energy buyer in this case, again, agrees to pay a fixed price per megawatt hour over time. The large renewable energy project delivers electricity to the local market. And that electricity is then sold and returned to the project, who passes it along to the energy buyer along with the RECs. So the energy buyer is in effect entering into a fixed for floating swap, where they are paying a fixed amount per megawatt hour and receiving a market rate for that same megawatt hour. And they're also receiving the RECs. And one of the reasons why you might want to do this is that it's very flexible. It doesn't really matter where you are or your local regulatory environment. The only thing that matters is that the project is located in a market where this large renewable energy project can sell the electricity. Further, this can be particularly attractive for entities that have a large number of facilities, in some cases facilities with relatively small loads that are distributed geographically, and they want to do one centralized transaction to offset the load at all of those places. So finally, once buyers have gone through the various types of transactions that are available, they should consider the potential barriers and seek help when necessary. Now, my team at RMI has developed a whole host of resources that are available on our website, which essentially provide frameworks and detailed guidance to help buyers walk through these types of transactions. I will note that the intended or the primary audience here is local city staff, because that is the focus of our program. But the learnings and general insights that are here should be generally applicable to whomever you are. And finally, just to end on a sort of a positive note, I wanted to flag that collectively, the individual actions that cities and large companies are taking are leading to really systemic, broad changes. If we look at this corporate transactions over the last 5 years, they amount to roughly 22 gigawatts of new renewable energy capacity. And meanwhile, local US governments have announced roughly 8 more gigawatts since 2015. And combined, that 30 gigawatts may be enough to equal or be equivalent to the total generation of some countries, such as Finland or Switzerland or Austria. So these small actions by a lot of different entities are really adding up over time. So with that, I will stop sharing, and thank you. Or do I stop sharing now, Vincent?
Yes, I went ahead and stopped you. So we're going to open it up for about 5 minutes of Q&A, and then Cole and Stephen have generously offered to stay on the line if you'd like to continue the question and answer. Cole, let me bring you back up on your video, and if you'd like to do your question and see if anybody got it right, we can start there. And you're on mute there, Cole.
Yes, I saw the answers and nobody quite got it. A couple were close. So I will share my screen real quick and I will tell you the answer.
$28 on the line.
Let's see here if it came up. And so this is the answer to the question. So 28 years ago, can you see my screen all right? Yes. Severin Suzuki Well, basically 28 years ago, a young woman, I believe Severin was 12 or 13 years old, spoke to the Rio Convention and spoke truth to power. And 2 years ago, Greta did the same thing. And I thought it was remarkable that it was 26 years between the two of them, and that many of the folks that were celebrating Greta's comments were not aware that Severin had done something comparable. I think she was actually called the speech that silenced the world for 5 minutes. And she and her other students raised the money to go all the way to Rio. And I highly recommend anybody listen to this 8 minutes. It can be found on YouTube.
Thank you, Cole. So very close, James, with the Rio Climate Accord. The one main question, two questions that came up in the Q&A, and again, there's more time to get to both of them, but there's a question about microgrids and how they play into probably both of your conversations. And then sort of building on that, the question is about CCAs or community choice aggregation and how those both play into your. Would you mind both talking about both of those, microgrids and CCAs, and how they relate?
Yeah, I answered the microgrid question. I was just about to answer the CCA question. Any load serving entity, actually for the city of San Francisco, I'm speaking here specifically around the solar resilient example, that was led by a city agency. The most recent work in the county of Alameda and the county of San Mateo, as well as elsewhere, is appearing to either be led by CCAs, and CCAs are community choice aggregators, for those not familiar with them. So they are essentially load serving entities that parallel an aspect of the utility. So they don't provide any wires in the ground typically, but they procure the energy source. And maybe Steve, that'd be a good way for you to come in a little bit on the procurement side.
Yeah, we view CCAs as a really effective means through which communities in some states can take control of their energy supply. So it's exactly what Cole said. The wires and the poles continue to be operated by an independent utility, but CCAs allow communities to accelerate the transition to renewables, and in many cases, as we've seen, reduce the rates for their ratepayers by signing up for these new renewable projects that are very cost effective.
Great, thank you. And we're going to be concluding our session now. If you do want to join any of the tool demos, you can go back onto the agenda page of the website and click any of those links to join any of the demos. Cole and Steve have agreed to stay on the line. Cole will be host and manage additional Q&A if there are questions. So you feel free to stay on the line. This is like you going up to the speaker after the presentation and ask your questions. Feel free to stay on. But if you'd like to join the tool demos, they'll start in approximately 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Vincent. I'm not sure if we're actually able to open it up for questions, so I'm just going to state the questions as I read them. And you mentioned, I love that graph and use it frequently. Has it changed? Maybe you're about to answer that. Maybe you could highlight which graph you're talking about. I'm assuming maybe it's the duck curve, but I'll wait for your clarification on that. Sheena mentioned that the grid needs money to exist and energy degrades. So I think that was more of a comment. And then also, oh, how is this accounted for? Which I think was your follow-up, Sheena.
I'm speculating. Oh, no, I misunderstood the question, I realize.
Sheena, we may need you to just rephrase that question.
If we're talking about the transmission and distribution, I will note that those are charges that are still being paid. If you look at an electric bill, it's going to have an energy component and then also a transmission and distribution component. So those values might be going to different parties depending on your local regulatory structure. But the actual infrastructure is being paid for largely by ratepayers.
Let's see, then there's a question from Laura. Is that like a CCA accepting nuclear power allocations? And that was at 202. So I think, Steve, that must have been part of your presentation.
Yeah.
I'll let
I'm
you
afraid
think.
I think I could use some more clarification on the question.
Okay, Laura, go ahead and repost it if there's some clarification you can offer. From an anonymous attendee, what are the best options, the hierarchy as it were, for building owners in choosing off-site options to drive overall decarbonization? And how do we evade paying utilities to simply meet their legal obligations? Steve?
Yeah, I don't think there is a single answer. Going back to that one of the earlier slides, I think it does come down to what buyers' priorities are. And those different mechanisms that I went through will get at different priorities. If we're talking about overall decarbonization, there's an argument that larger projects will do that more speedily than smaller projects. And we could probably get into the weeds quite a bit on exactly where to site those projects, et cetera, for the most decarbonization benefit. But I'll limit myself to saying that some grids are cleaner than others. So you might want to think about that as you're thinking about where to buy your renewable energy.
Mr. Anderson, Kel Anderson asks, what is the best way, either method or resources, for an architect or an owner to begin to assess the various quality and cost of offsite power for a single project at a time?
I think the costs are maybe the easier part of that question. There's increasingly good data around the costs of wind and solar across the United States, at least, that can be accessed. LBNL, or Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, puts out some great reports around those. The quality is, I think, more of a subjective value, and I would refer again back to my priorities slide. I think it will vary dramatically, potentially, between buyers, what they view as a quality project. And that will simply have to be done in collaboration with the building owner to better understand, would be my answer.
M. Holt asks, how have PUCs helped or hampered the proliferation of community scale renewables and storage? There's probably a few answers to that one also, right? And one aspect for community scale renewables that has, at least in California and I believe elsewhere in the country, Steve, you might be able to comment on that, been a challenge is the transference of electrons across public right-of-way. That's a regulated space, and for the most part is a no-go if you don't own both properties between that, across that public right-of-way. So the idea of putting in a community scale renewable generator in your neighbor's parking lot and feeding your building across the street is not something that is currently allowed. Thermal energy is different. You can put a chiller or a boiler across the street and move thermal energy, but not electrons.
And I would note that how much PUCs have helped versus hampered, and the power that they have to do so varies quite dramatically across the country. And, we've seen some PUCs, I think, that have really pushed utilities to roll out more programs that would enable local renewables and storage, and some PUCs have not done that. And so that we've seen a real range in the uptake and adoption of these types of programs, depending on the PUC as well as the state legislator and other key decision makers.
A question from Hallie Gardner. Do you have any suggestions regarding strategies to pair renewable energy generators with small, medium-scale projects looking to procure renewables to offset their energy? We've seen success on a larger scale, but find smaller projects have a more challenging time with this. And I will just note the tool demonstrations are just starting for those of you that are waiting for this to start, but we'll stay on.
I don't have a silver bullet For that question, Haley, I think RFPs continue to be a staple for potential buyers, and ideally pair that with some patience, because if a developer is starting from ground zero, these projects can take a few years to get built.
Yeah, it may be that, and I'm not sure how small and medium scale you're mentioning, Ali. That would be probably good context to understand kind of at what scale you're suggesting. But I think one of the things that both Steve and I would agree with is that the magic to the proliferation of renewables is the scaling of them. So one-off small projects are not the path for scaling renewables. It's the programmatic and you know, whether it's a program of dozens or hundreds of facilities across the city, or thousands of residential units, or multi-megawatt utility scale installations, that's where the economy scale comes and the financial backing to move them forward.
Catherine, on your question of purchasing frameworks allowed by state, that map that I showed was only speaking to green tariffs. California is a complicated state. There are some entities are allowed to purchase directly in a retail choice manner. Others are not, and that's somewhat a element of history and the partial deregulation that happened before the energy crisis in the early 2000s. I will say things, so physical PPAs may be available, virtual PPAs definitely are. What we've seen a lot of in California, I think, is on-site solar, because the resource tends to be quite good and energy prices are pretty high. And CCAs, which somebody else mentioned, have really taken off in California, which have given not individual building owners or individual residents necessarily a lot of options, but allow communities at large to really scale up their ambitions.
And Ben, I see your question about recyclability of solar panels. I'm actually going to put a resource for you in the answer field, and you come back to us if you'd like some more information. Catherine, what is the status of solar resilient? Is this being implemented in California? So Catherine, so solarresilient.org is alive. Anybody on this phone call can go there and interact with it. I think there are tool demos that are happening 2 or 3 times today still, one going on right now. And it was developed by the feds, or is funded by the feds, so it is a public tool set. There's also all the case studies and everything are still held on the City of San Francisco website. So all that is alive and well. The procurement path for the City of San Francisco is a slow one, a bureaucratic one, and they have a lot of things that they're working through. The procurement path for the County of Alameda and the County of San Mateo is currently underway. So they're in more active stages. And then there are CCAs and utilities around California, as well as on the East Coast, that are using solar resilient right now. Jen Culbertson, I see our utility charges a small consumer 2.2 cents per kilowatt hour for renewable power. Is there a compilation of rates anywhere?
One resource I would point you to there is the Department of Energy's state and local energy data, or SLED database, which has state averages. I'm not aware of one specific to renewable rates offhand, although there may well be one. NREL, or the National Renewable Energy Lab, might be a good place to look for that type of information.
And I thanks, Jan, for clarifying that's a surcharge of 2.2 cents. I thought you had very inexpensive renewable power, and that would be fantastic, of course. And I do invite, I think other people can comment to open questions or to any questions. So I recognize this is a learning group and there's over 100 people still on the call. So if there's additional insights that any of you experts out there would like to add to the discussion, please type in, we invite you to type in your answer or clarification to any of the questions that have been asked, or commentary on the slides. anonymous attendee asks, do you think in the future there should be requirements for RECs, especially in communities, building typologies where on-site renewables aren't an option?
There's, I think I'd be interested, Cole, on your thoughts on individual buildings. I will say first, at the state level, many states have put in place what are called renewable portfolio standards, which essentially do require local utilities or electricity providers to source a certain percentage of their energy from renewables, and that is largely tracked through RECs, and in some cases is fulfilled through unbundled REC purchases. So at a state or regional level, sometimes those requirements are in existence and arguably have done quite a lot to help accelerate the adoption of renewables in the US, at least.
Yeah, the statement of should there be requirements for RECs, I think, speaks to regulation. So, you know, basically that's a question for whether or not there's regulatory authority to move in that direction. And Steve, you mentioned the PUCs have various, or differ across the country, and we should recognize this is in America's North and South and Central group on the call today as well. So, you know, speaking from a climate crisis standpoint and highlighting the low cost that I did earlier, and I think Steve has highlighted also, it's functionally not a sizable burden, in my opinion, to move to 100% renewable energy as it was years ago. So from an economic burden standpoint, there are even cases to be made that it should be a lower cost economic future than, since the cost of fuel, the fuel source, is a fixed cost for renewable energy systems versus the variable cost for natural or a fossil-fired energy source. There was actually, I don't know if we have another question. Oh, yep. So KL asks, so the zero code, now part of IECC, requires offsite renewables. Do you have any insight into how the purchasing of this might work? I guess, KL, do you mean purchasing on an individual project basis, or do you mean, I think what you mean is not the aggregator, but at the project level. My understanding is it's similar to what I described in my code compliance chain, that there's an authorization path to go to offsite REC purchasing. But I encourage you to go to the zero code, and there should be and if that's what you're asking about. If you're asking about how the aggregator is pulling the renewables together, the intermediary, as Steve described, then I think that would be just as any of the means that Steve highlighted, the purchase of RECs can come about. Now there's maybe an issue here, which we're kind of glossing over, Steve, which is the time value of those RECs and the time value of those emissions, which is probably the next, like the elephant in the room a little bit of what hasn't been resolved. I don't know, Steve, if you want to comment on that. Or just agree.
Yeah, we've seen there's a variety of REC markets, both nationally within the US and internationally. And the values are all over the place based on the regulation in the various regions and what's required, going back to that RPS that we talked about. You know, but carbon, once it's in the atmosphere, is not region specific. So there's clearly an argument that those costs should all be aligned at some point.
Jen asked a follow-up question. Locally, we have promoted small PPAs to fund rooftop solar for houses of worship and nonprofit organizations. You do need angel investors, but it benefits it ultimately benefits the organizations who can't access the federal tax credits. Thanks, Jen. That's wonderful to hear. Oh, Steve, how do you see the market for offsite renewables changing over the next 5 years? Maturing in certain ways, some pathways kind of sunsetting that maybe aren't appropriate anymore. You know, will VPPAs virtual power purchase agreements become more to the fore, or are they always going to be somewhat niche? Those kind of questions. Where do you see it going?
It's a great question. I think costs will broadly continue to fall, although possibly at lower rates. In the US, we're expecting to see the sunsetting of various tax credits, which will, in the short term, might increase costs a bit. But I think the industry has continued to surprise everybody by lowering costs on both solar and wind. I think we will continue to see interest uptick from non-traditional players. I think large companies are here to stay. I think cities are going to continue to drive a lot of additional renewables and act as leaders in their communities. And the exact contracts that those entities will use will vary. I think companies are a lot more happier with virtual contracts given their geographically diverse operations and places. Things like universities, municipalities, CCAs are likely, I would expect, are going to continue to have a very specific focus on promoting local projects, which will hopefully continue to see and drive renewables adoption outside of the places where it's been most focused so far, so that everybody will start benefiting more.
Okay, well, I'll just read the last couple of comments just in case others can't read them. Gina, you learned a lot that touches on projects that you're working on, including a community roadmap for downtown Toronto, and the presentation was a taster letting me know where to look for more info. That's great. And then the graph on cost of renewables, emphasizing the larger installations, was confirming. Also feel frustrated with our regulatory environment in Michigan compared with other states. Yeah. Well, thanks everybody. I think there's still 68 people on the call, but we're gonna retire there, and hopefully this was valuable. Steve, thanks for joining me. And thanks for Vincent, who is off on another tool demo, I think, right now.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.